I'm live. Everyone in the world is watching me right now. This is so exciting. Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here at IRDC 2015, the first of two they'll be running this year, because Darren will be doing one, or someone is doing one in Nottingham in another month, and Todd is convinced this one will win. And so thank you very much, Todd. He invited me down here to show this one because I've been fortunate enough to have been to previous IRDCs. So he says, what do you exactly do at one of these IRDCs? An IRDC is, of course, an international roguelike developer conference. So we do lots of neat things, such as discuss philosophy of games and philosophy of roguelikes. We discuss game design theories. And then we also work down into specific nitty-gritty details, because often we're a lot of coders here and we start talking about C++ or programming techniques or why Java is horrible or so on and so forth. And sometimes we get down and start playing some roguelike Pictionary. Now, for this talk, I decided at first I was going to just talk about why balance is bad for game design. But then I thought, then I might have time for question and answers and be torn all apart. So instead, I'll just take my 30 minutes and try and do 3 talks in it. And so let's see, it's 20, I've got it until 50. And cover 3 separate areas. I'll skip the roguelike Pictionary and just go into these 3 areas. The first one's talking about philosophy. So this is a very high-level question, and I'm not actually going to talk about the details of the brilliant interpretation at all. And so I'm just going to talk about the whole raison d'etre, like, should we have a brilliant interpretation? And is this really the worst thing that ever happened to the roguelike community? When you ask the question, what is a roguelike, I should ask for a show of hands. Who here knows what a roguelike is? That's good. Most people did raise their hand for those people on Twitch or whatever, because it is kind of a very important question, because if you're going to go to a conference called a Roguelike Developer Conference and you don't know what a roguelike is, there are problems. But it's also the least important question, because when we make any particular game, it does not matter in the end whether that game is a roguelike or not. It's the same game. Recently, we had apparently insects were always categorized next to millipedes and the little arthropoda phylum, whatever the taxonomists deal with, and they recently decided, oh no, they actually should be next to crustaceans. And no insect in the world actually knows this happened or cares this happened. The butterflies are the same butterfly they were before. So taxonomy is something that's very useful and important, but it should not affect game design. And whenever you make a game, you might start with a roguelike, but if that game wants to go another direction, you should follow the game's needs and not worry about, whether or not some pundit on the internet will call it a roguelike. Other communities have this problem, fortunately, so it's not something we have of not being able to define roguelikes. You look at science fiction, and, well, they don't even know what to call themselves. And I think at least with the roguelikes, we've managed to defeat the people who said there should be a hyphen inside roguelike, and it's just one word now. So I think we might be slightly ahead of science fiction in that respect. We get back, and then we say, well, who is it that should define what a roguelike is? And I would say it's, of course, the Cable, the secretive organization behind all roguelike development. But then, who is the Cable? You look up on Google, and you see some pictures of people from IRDC, and you see rather tellingly the 70-year-old 2012. In my mind, that the Cable is anyone who writes a roguelike or attends one of these conferences. In other words, people have spent the time and effort to try and think about what roguelikes are outside of just playing them. And so, congratulations, you're all now part of the Cable and can carry your secret badge. Of course, you can't show it to anyone because it's a secret Cable, but it does mean now you can decide what a roguelike is. In Berlin, which was the first IRDC, we spent the first day doing talks like we're going to do at this one here, and talked about stuff like discretization of time and space, the symbolism of the ASCII characters used in roguelikes, and why Python is an excellent language for roguelike development. And then on the second day, we had done all of our talks, and we said, let's just try and decide what a roguelike is, because nothing could go wrong with that idea. And we started with Slash's definition, which had been himself informed by a lot of discussion on Rec Games roguelike development. And we hashed it out over the day. And then we continued online over email for like weeks afterwards, I think, until we actually got something everyone could sign off on. So this is very much the work of a committee. And it shows that because, committees produce a certain type of work. But I think for things like definitions, it's the right thing to use for creating something that's more disliked by everyone but useful to everyone. And it really centralized what was previously an ad hoc patchwork of definitions. Now, when I told Todd I wanted to talk about the Berlin interpretation, he said in the summary that I was going to apologize for it. And I'm very sorry, I'm not going to apologize for it, because I said that I was going to give an apologia for it. And there's a subtle difference between the two. Because an apologia is just a rhetorical technique to defend yourself. And one of the two things you could do are corrective actions or mortification, and I'm not going to do either of those. I'm just going to focus in, denial and evasion of responsibility and try and reduce the offensiveness a bit so people don't lynch me on the streets. So first of all is the denial. Definitely one of the big arguments against the Berlin interpretation is it results in people having to change their game or being kicked out of the roguelike club or all this sort of elitist stuff that I don't think any of us particularly likes, because we'd rather spend our time making good games than worrying what the categorization of those games are. And the Berlin interpretation very clearly says at the very beginning that this is not meant to do that. So if we say, do not stick your hand in the meat grinder, and people stick their hand in the meat grinder, what level of reliability do we actually have? Well, therein rightly points out that if you leave a meat grinder lying on the street where a bunch of children play, you shouldn't be surprised that some stick their hands in there. And I can't help but look at what I did with Powder itself. When I first made Powder, I actually made a definition for a roguelike, because at the time there was no good definitions for roguelikes. And at the time, a lot of people would say that it had to be ASCII. And it happened to be due to the nature of the hardware, the Game Boy Advance. I couldn't do ASCII, and so I felt I needed to sort of defend myself. So rather than change my game to fit the definition of roguelikes other people had, I just made my own definition and put it up online like everyone else did in those days. And I got kind of surprised because people would actually cite this as an authoritative definition of roguelikes when it's just some guy that just one day wrote something up. And then I looked further at what I did over the last few years. I've been making 7-day roguelikes every year. And it's an interesting question of how many of these are roguelikes. And I don't mean by the Berlin interpretation, I mean by my personal definition. How many people here would think, say, how could I phrase this? Okay, so that think all of them are roguelikes. Raise hands, any? Okay, oh, that's true. That's unfair. You mean you've not played all my works before? Yes, so how many people think none of them are roguelikes? Okay, so we're somewhere in between. And when I do my own list, I get about half of them. So half of the 7-day roguelikes I made are not roguelikes by my own definition. And this is a good thing, because I didn't start off saying I'm going to make a shoot 'em up. I started off saying I'm going to make a roguelike. But as I made the game, it veered what is, in my opinion, outside of that genre and ended up somewhere else, which is just totally fine, but is also just me showing by example that I don't think anything like the Berlin interpretation should prescribe people. Because when we get right down to it, what a definition is a bludgeon to prove a point on the internet. That's why we define things, right? And by this argument, as soon as we made a definition for roguelikes, we had already failed. The people out there that want to use it to be elitist and kick people out will use your tool against them, and there's nothing you could do to stop them, so you should just not make a definition. Which gets us to evasion of responsibility, where I explain our good intentions and explain why we're doing something good in creating a definition. First of all, why do we have a word roguelike at all? This is because as humans, one of our great powerful things we have is the ability to sort of chunkify complex ideas into new terms and symbols. And one of the complex ideas out there is this sort of locus point of all these games. They're similar to Rogue, and they have something in common and similar to them that we can't really put our fingers on, but we want to be able to say what sort of game would scratch my roguelike itch and identify those and express them to others. And so that's why I want a word for roguelikes. But then why do we need a definition? Surely I can tell what's a roguelike or not. The problem is you really need a definition as soon as you go to someone who's a non-native speaker. I find this with English. As a native speaker, there's a lot of words that I use all the time that I would actually not be able to articulate a clear definition for. But I believe I use them correctly, because I believe that English is dictionaries are descriptive and not prescriptive, so I by definition use them correctly. But when someone from a foreign language says, what does that word mean? It's really wonderful to go to a dictionary and see a nice, simple definition that actually clearly explains it. And 9 times out of 10, that's what happens. And that's why we need a definition for roguelike, is so we can have that sort of dictionary definition to get people over the hump. Because it is a very complicated gestalt thing, but that doesn't help when you're trying to explain to someone outside that hasn't spent 100 hours playing roguelikes. The other big reason is categorization. I believe that roguelikes deserve to be a category unto themselves. And this seems kind of like a pointless thing to say nowadays, that everyone throws roguelike on every single thing they submit to the internet, it seems. But back in 2008, roguelikes were not a catchword in the indie community. And I actually talked to someone who was working on a meta-analysis of games, and they had analyzed all the games that were out there and automatically determined genres for them. And I said, well, which genre would, so roguelike's a genre, right? And he says, no, what's that? And I say, well, where do you put Diablo? Oh, Diablo's an action RPG. And I was like, but it's not an RPG, and its action is, it really is a subset from the roguelike world. And the problem is their entire database was predicated on commercial games, and commercial games since like 2000 or something. So naturally, it did not capture any of this nature. So if we want there to be a roguelike classification, it is important to at least get a definition out there for people to work with, and in particular provide paratypes, the sort of things that can be used to define it more precisely. So this brings us to the other big problem with the Berlin interpretation, namely we committed the cardinal sin of analysis. Analysis is a really powerful tool that we use as humans to understand complicated, sticky, organic things by cutting them up into little tiny pieces, and then we can understand each of those little pieces, and then of course we understand the whole. Well, we don't. I love Darren's analogy. He goes and says, trying to define the features that make a roguelike so special is akin to describe a cake's flavor as being flour, butter, water, and sugar, because that just fails to describe the flavor, what makes the cake special. Which I'll just segue into then, what about ASCII? Now, the Berlin interpretation says ASCII is a component of being a roguelike, and I made a definition myself specifically to avoid ASCII being a requirement for roguelikes. So what do I feel about its existence in the Berlin interpretation? Well, we know what Darren feels. It's a completely bad idea that has absolutely nothing to do with the resulting game. But over the years, I've really changed my mind on that, because I think that was really driven from this same sin of analysis. Namely, as a sort of game designer, I become a game mechanics snob. I look behind the window dressed and look only at the game mechanics, and that becomes the real game to me. But that's not how users play the game. They see it as a whole, and they experience it as a whole. So everything, the controls, the aesthetics, the setting, the device, all affect how they perceive and interact with it. Because humans are very complex creatures that are affected by all these side channels of communication. Like, for example, controls. Going from the DS to the iPhone was a huge change, merely going from a stylus to a finger. And that changes not just how you interact with the game, but how the game feels for certain common interactions. Which brings me back to my analogy here, which is that ASCII, in my mind, is the egg of roguelikes, of the roguelike cake. And so you can easily skip the egg in a roguelike cake. You can add some vinegar, and you'll get the baking powder to activate just as well. But a lot of people out there will say it's not a cake if there's no egg, and as this random definition I got on the internet says. And of course, we have the nice case of Darren, who I guess over in Britain they don't have eggs in their cake, so he doesn't include it at all. So I thought that makes a nice, perfect analogy there. And finally, just to reduce offensiveness, I'll just underline what is probably the key contribution to the Berlin interpretation, which came up pretty quick in the process. And it's this idea that it is not like Rogue. Because there is a difference there. It's not games like Rogue, it is a genre of games that we happen to call roguelike. That's why we got rid of the hyphen. And it's represented by a canon of games. These are the paratypes from which you can derive whether or not other things are in the same category or not, which we listed as ADOM, Angband, Crawl, and NetHack and Rogue, which I think has remained uncontentious through the years, and hopefully we can move on and not have to spend our time talking about what roguelikes are. So that covers the bit of philosophy, and before anyone can attack me on it, I'll switch over to a less contentious topic of why balance is considered harmful for game design. So that's what's kind of nice about a roguelike development conference, is we can talk about something like this and assume we're talking about roguelikes and work inside of that framework. Because that does not make much sense for most of the AAA games out there. It would be simply insane to make that claim. We want balance because we want our games to be winnable. We want our games to be fair because we believe that risk deserves reward. And also tied to risk deserves reward, a really key component is we want all of our content to be used. So I'm going to go into this a little bit. And the first question is, what does it mean for a game to be winnable? Now, usually with roguelikes, the idea is I've got some character, brand new character. Will this character be able to win the game through some sequence of actions I pick? And our concern is always, maybe in my game, there's a deck of cards that could be shuffled that, like in solitaire, means I can't actually win this game no matter what I pick. And that sort of worries us, and that's usually what we think of being unbalanced or not winnable. But that's not the definition of winnability in most AAA games, like a Mass Effect 3. I'm pretty sure in Mass Effect 3, to be winnable means every encounter you have to be able to survive. Because if I play for 15 hours and I save my game just before I fight some boss, and then I can't defeat that boss no matter what I do, a lot of players will consider that game unfair and unwinnable, and because they don't accept the fact that their decisions 10 hours ago has led to their demise now. Whereas with roguelikes, we trivially violate that all the time. It's considered a feature of roguelikes that after playing for 10 hours, you might die because 5 hours ago you did not conserve enough resources. And that's learn, do better next time. So by that same logic, I'd say that for roguelikes, we shouldn't even worry about whether or not any particular character can survive. We should worry whether or not the person playing the game can survive with enough plays of the game. So this comes down to, it doesn't matter if any particular dungeon you generate is a winnable dungeon, because in many ways the user has no way of telling whether it would have been winnable or not, because it's destroyed and they get to start over again from the beginning, and they never know if that dungeon was winnable. And also, in a real sense, you don't know if it would be winnable or not. Like, we have the idea of a deck of cards for solitaire where you've picked your random numbers ahead of time. But there's a lot of random numbers in most roguelikes, if you're not Darren Gray, that is. And if you look at that random number sequence and cause it to whiff every single time that you try and hit a monster, you're going to be guaranteed to lose. And you say, okay, that's an impossible random number sequence because I'm using some Merton twister thing that has a guaranteed period. Well, if it's not cryptographically secure, the player can analyze the random numbers they're getting and then determine where they are in the sequence and then predict all future random numbers and indeed induce random number rolls in order to adjust the result. This attack has actually been done on NetHack, where people in open servers, there are certain actions that would use random numbers without actually changing the game state. So you could advance the seed to a certain point you want and then guarantee that the next fountain you drink at will give you a wish. And so, yes, definitely. It's just a reminder, though, that the opposite is also true, that every game's winnable because I can hack the random number generator. So we don't need to worry about that level of winnability. We just have to make sure that eventually you can win the game. And for stuff like Powder, if you get to the bottom level, I don't guarantee that the rooms are connected because, damn it, you should have a wand of digging by that point or know how to dig. This is the big reason why AAA games want balance, because all content has to be used. This is, of course, Penny Arcade in the poor. I think his name is Vorgoth, but I might have forgotten his name. That makes it even sadder. That is being ignored by the people running through the dungeon because they know his risk versus reward just falls on the wrong side of their balance, and they're just going to drop him on the floor. This doesn't happen in truly procedural games because there isn't a static spawn point of the same guy who you can always ignore. You don't know what the treasure behind that guy is, and it might be set up for this dungeon, I can ignore him, but the next dungeon, he's in my way and I have to fight him. The skeletons in Powder are overpowered for their level. They're unbalanced. And so if you're a smart player, you'll try not to fight them early on if you don't have to, or you'll use your bigger resources to fight them. But you might have no choice but to fight them in one dungeon seed, and another dungeon seed you might not encounter them. And so all the content does get used regardless of their balance level. This ties into the other important part of roguelikes, which is the opposite of that. Namely, we need to have really rare content. There has to be stuff that shows up every 1,000 games, and you want 1,000 different things that show up every 1,000 games, so people keep getting different experiences because they will play this game 1,000 times. In some ways, the very first level of your game has to be the most interesting because that's where players will spend most of their time, creating new characters and dying, and creating new characters and dying, creating new characters, dying, creating new characters. Wand of Vision! Oh my gosh, and dying. So this is just my favorite Pit Viper joke that's in NetHack, which of course shows up very rarely, but every time it shows up, people have to post to the group saying, no one's ever seen this before. And then people are like, oh my gosh, I've seen this so many times on this news group. This then ties to the other big problem with balance is if you have something that's balanced, it means you could actually compare the different things together. And this is what I get after Angband about a lot, is you have a nice orthogonal series of hellhounds. You've got the same orthogonal series of dragons and the same orthogonal series of worms. And so everything becomes just another damage type, another monster type, and you can have some point system where you can say exactly how each monster compares to the other. Well, if we're going to go to the work of making another monster, another item, I always believe that it should require net new code and should be done in a way that you can't actually compare it to anything else in your game. And if you can't compare it to anything else in your game because it's unique and different enough, then you can't balance it either. And so if your goal is to have everything balanced, you're going to naturally say, I better file this off. This is too weird. I can't understand how to balance it. Well, no, I'd rather you just keep it weird and see what happens as you do it. And the other kind of interesting thing is playing a game like Dungeon Master, which is one of these old games before people knew how to design games in today's modern, clear Excel spreadsheet way. There's always these things that just seem wrong from a game design perspective, but then they add texture and really change the feel of the game. And you realize this is actually something that we lose when we make things too simple. And I have the trouble with a lot of games that you play that you start playing it and then you see underneath, you're like, oh, I see exactly how this is set up. This is the algebra of the underlying game, and I don't need to play it anymore. I'm sort of done. But if you have something which is unique and strange, then and layers those uniques and strangeness without concern over trying to make everything orthogonal, you get something messy that is a lot more interesting. And because that's what us humans really like is, messy things, because we ourselves are messy. So that covers why balance is bad, and by my watch I have exactly 10 minutes now to do my last section, and then there'll be no time for Q&A, so I'll have this time perfectly. So people accuse me for brilliant interpretation having a pretentious title, but if you want pretentious titles, I think I've done a better job on this one. So towards an algebra of roguelikes. I did this a few years ago at an IRDC, and it was my most requested slide deck, but I don't think the slides made any sense to people I gave it to. And I've simplified it in this round, and so hopefully it makes some sense live. My conclusions here are kind of obvious, but I did have to learn them myself, so hopefully someone out there will learn from this. But please don't be too embarrassed on my behalf if you think it's obvious. I'm going to use the term class to be C++ style objects, mob or monsters. Map is your whole game level, and a tile will be one of the little squares on your map, or hexes, depending on what you have. When you make a roguelike, the first thing you have to do is figure out how to restore this map in memory. And the logical idea is you have a 2D array of tiles, and people are really lucky in the dark old days of C compilers, because there was only really one way to do it. You made a big array of ints, and those ints were indices into your tile structure, so you could look up what type of thing was stored in each tile. Unfortunately, as things like Java and object-oriented programming increased, a lot of people started to imagine I should have a full tile object which stores what is contained in each of these tiles. So it can store its properties, its sprites, its burnability, what monsters are on it, what items are on it. But there's two problems I have with this. The first is a good structure of array versus an array of structures problem. And in programming, you've got two ways usually if you've got a big array of data to work with it. One is to have one array, and inside that array have some complicated structure for each element. And the other is to have a structure which has multiple arrays in it. And the second way seems like a weird inversion of the setup, but that is the most efficient for almost all programming needs. It's also the most efficient algorithmically, because if you have some data which you can compress it independently of the rest of the data. The obvious one is stuff like the monster list. I don't need to store a monster on every single tile, because usually they're small enough I could store a linked list or some search tree of monsters to run over. And then when I want to find all the monsters in my game, I don't have to search all tiles around me. I just have to search that monster list, and actually get a much faster search as a result. But there's another reason to go to the structure of arrays, is that it helps you think efficiently as a programmer, because programming in some ways is a compression process where you're trying to compress your code and make it as simple as possible, because the fewer lines of code you have, the less bugs you have, right? And you have questions as soon as you have tiles of classes. Do these tiles know where they are on the map? And if they don't know where they are on the map, how do you find the neighboring tiles? So for example, I've got a tree that is currently burning, and I want to have the trees beside it catch on fire. How do I find the trees that are beside me? And if you do store positions on the tiles, you have a lot of redundant data. You've got these pointers on the map pointing to the tile, and the tile pointing back to the map, and it gets horribly complicated. So I've always rejected the idea of tiles being objects, and vociferously claimed that you should just have flat arrays of indices and things like this to store it and do everything at the map level. So in Powder, I use XY pairs, and so I have two integers that store where you are on the map. When I made a roguelike for the Impulse watch, I had it even easier, because I just used a single integer which was an offset on the map. So if you want to move up one in Y, you just add the width of the map to it. But nowadays, of course, we would use a coordinate class, something like a vector class, that wraps up your x and y and cuts them out of typing down, unless you have nice little plus operators to add things together. And this certainly is nice, but it is conflated two different concepts, one being points and the other being vectors. A point is a position in space, and a vector is a displacement between 2 points. And you can't, for example, add 2 points together. That's not something that actually makes sense. Yeah, I only can add a vector to a point. Similarly, I can't say, is there a monster at this vector location? Because there's no origin, no position to talk about it relative to. And when you make this transition, which I did for Jacob's matrix, I created a position class, and this position class stores your x and y coordinates, but also stores the map that you're in. And this small change proved incredibly effective. Because when you want to try and find a monster at a certain position, usually I would have advocated you have a map object and you ask it, is there a monster at this x and y location? You know, maybe as a coordinate, so I just say position. The people who like tile objects would say, I ask the map and I get the tile from that map, and then I ask that tile if it has the monster. And however, if we have the position, know about the map, it becomes a lot simpler. We just ask the position, is there a mob at this position? And what I found was this position ends up looking very much like the interface people were creating for their tiles. The big difference is it's a pointer to a tile, or not a pointer in the programming sense where it's just a raw pointer, but because it has the x, y, and positions, you're able to find neighbors and able to find all those fun stuff. And so this becomes the object that you end up using for integrating with your map. You don't use the map object anymore. And the neat thing about this, we've dropped the x and y into a position object, and now we can sort of break this artificial x-y duality that we have from Descartes and start to think outside of the box and say, what happens if we get rid of coordinates entirely for a roguelike? And that's what I've been trying to do with mixed success. And this is the sort of algebra of roguelikes that I ended up with, which is you have the direction, which is the equivalent of a vector, and your position, which is where you are in the map. And I can add these positions to directions to get new positions. And the directions has some interesting choices on it, which are an artifact of it being a roguelike world. I can add an integer to a direction to rotate it. Now this is what assumes that we have a discrete manifold. So each location has a manifold around it. There's no like three-way intersections. There's always a flat disk, topologically equivalent. And I've got a certain number of discrete directions I can go in around that place. I've got the idea of negating a direction to go in the opposite direction, but this is not an additive inverse. If I go forward one direction and back the same direction, I don't end up where I started all the time. You can have one-way portals, or you could have stuff that falls off the edge of the world and gives you an invalid position. And similarly, I can build up sort of a path, which is just a sequence of directions. So the other neat thing with Jacob's matrix, which was really fun but confuses the heck out of users, is to make the position relative to the facing. So it stores not just the, next one, not just the map, but also the angle that you're sitting on the map. And so when I say go north, I mean go north relative to my current position. So if you rotate your position, all your directions become relative. And that makes writing algorithms to move around a lot easier because you're completely direction invariant. And you have portals that twist your direction. You don't have to worry about that anywhere in your code. It just happens for you automatically. So those are some of the essential operations you need to work on this. And I've just got a couple examples of ways of using it that I think show how things get simpler when you use this expression. So if I want to do a cave builder, this is a drunken walk cave builder, I can start with the map and just wipe it to pound, search for a random pound, change to a dot, and then here I just get a position and increment the position, and I don't have to worry if this is a hex grid or a 4 grid or anything. I don't have any XY loops, and I don't have any direction dx dys. Similarly, for doing a maze, I can do something very similar. This has an assumption that you have a mod 2 topology, because I take 2 steps in a direction and assume that the result doesn't all overlap on each other. Similarly, we have random walking. I can just pick a random direction, see if I can move in this. It's really nice to have directions for AI, because often you're like, can I go this way? No. Oh, I want to check left and right. And getting a dx dy and converting it to left, right is annoying. Getting a direction in add and subtracting 1 is straightforward. Similarly for chasing, this is what gets a bit complicated because I need to find a way to build a path from one position to the other without knowing anything about my topology. And A* fails us here because it assumes we have a shortcut metric we can use to estimate our distance, and we don't have one because there could be any connectivity out there. So we just have to do a breadth-first search and build a distance map. But again, it's something completely independent of coordinates. This has worked well for working for hex or square and building portals, handling rotations. Though I must say, over the years of the 7-day RLs, I've removed rotations from all my implementations because people get horribly confused as soon as you have them. Although I did use that on purpose in Vicious Orcs. Stitching is what it's really beautiful for, because as you build a level, you don't have to worry about all your rooms lining up properly. You can just stitch them together and it'll work out. What I've always liked to do, but haven't really ever done on purpose, people think it happens because it just happens out of how it stitches stuff together, is spiral staircases, where you walk in a spiral down to get to the next level, so you have no hard transition of angle bracket stairs. And similarly, what I'd also like to do at some point is work with inside being larger than outside. For towns and things like that, it's so natural to have smaller buildings that are bigger inside, and you can do that with this without having to worry about any complicated code on your part. What does not work well has always been field of view. I always just punt and generate a 2D array of all positions around you using some breadth search, and then do FOV on that. Holistic map generators are a real pain, trying to do rooms and corridors or fractal noise. Again, I just build a 2D map and then stuff that into the system afterwards. Similarly, there's some really fast stuff you can do to estimate your direction, to see which direction you should step in to chase someone, and that doesn't exist in the system, and usually I've got hacks to look at the XY, so I'm not entirely pure. So what I do think is limiting X and Y is a good thing to go for. Instead, use coordinate classes, but better yet, use position classes that let you encompass your tiles in a very agnostic way, and things that become all XY become all position, all direction instead of DX, DY, and thank you very much.